The Great Minds series, The Invisible Prison. How Society Trains You to Be Average. Plato, Sigmund Freud, Robert Greene. You were born extraordinary. I am not saying that to make you feel good. I am saying it because it is biologically, neurologically, and historically true. Every human being arrives in this world with a nervous system of staggering complexity, a brain capable of learning virtually any skill, an imagination that can conceive of things that do not yet exist, and a drive to create, to build, to matter, that is as fundamental to human nature as hunger or breath. You were not born average. Average is not a natural state. Average is an achievement, and it takes an enormous, sustained, coordinated effort to produce it. The question this video asks is, who is doing that work? And how? Because if you look honestly at your life right now, at the gap between who you sense you could be and who you actually are, and you feel that gap is larger than it should be, I want you to consider the possibility that the distance is not your fault. Not entirely. You have been inside a system your entire life. A system with three interlocking components: school, family, and culture. And each of those components, operating simultaneously and in the same direction, has been quietly, consistently, and with the best of intentions doing one primary thing: teaching you how to be manageable, how to fit, how to comply, how to measure yourself against external standards rather than internal ones, how to want the things that are easy to give you and stop wanting the things that are difficult to control. Plato saw this system coming 400 years ago and described it in terms that will make you feel like he was watching your childhood. Freud mapped the psychological mechanism by which it operates on the individual mind, and Robert Greene spent decades documenting exactly how it functions in the social world, and what the rare individuals who escape it actually do differently. This is not a video about blaming the world for your problems. It is a video about seeing clearly, because you cannot escape a prison you do not know you are in. Let's begin. Video structure: the gap between who you are and who you could be. The introduction of the three-walled system that has been running your life without your permission. Part 1. The prison you cannot see. Plato's Allegory of the Cave. What the system actually is, how it operates, and why the most dangerous prisons are the ones that feel like home. Part 2. The first wall, school. How school converted your natural curiosity into a performance for grades. The hidden curriculum that was never about knowledge, it was always about compliance. Part 3. The second wall, family. The unspoken scripts, the invisible ceilings, and the deeply loving limitations that your family installed in you long before you had any say in the matter. Part 4. The third wall, culture. The pressure of common opinion. Why every revolutionary idea in history was first mocked, then resisted, then persecuted, and what that tells us about the culture we are swimming in right now. Part 5. The people who escaped, Leonardo da Vinci and Nikola Tesla. What they actually did differently, what the system could not ultimately take from them, and what their stories tell every person watching this. Part 6. How to break the walls. 5 concrete moves. See the walls, identify your specific ceiling, audit your environment, rebuild your relationship with deviation, and create something real. Part 1. The prison you cannot see. There is a thought experiment that has stayed with me since I first encountered it. Imagine you were raised from birth in a room. The room is comfortable. It has food, warmth, television, other people. Everyone in the room is kind to you. No one in the room is cruel. But the room has a ceiling. And from the moment you are old enough to move around, every time you reach upward and touch that ceiling, the people in the room, gently, lovingly, with genuine concern, guide your hand back down. They are not trying to trap you. They do not think of themselves as prison guards. They are simply passing on what they were taught. They were also raised in this room. They also had their hands guided back down. They believe the ceiling is there for your safety. They believe the ceiling is reality. Now imagine spending 20, 30, 40 years in that room. Imagine how thoroughly you would come to believe that the ceiling is the sky. That is the system we are talking about. Not a conspiracy. Not a deliberate malevolent plan to keep you small. Something far more insidious than that. A self-perpetuating architecture of belief, habit, and social pressure that reproduces itself automatically, generation after generation, because the people inside it genuinely believe in it. Plato called it the cave. In his Allegory of the Cave, prisoners chained from birth watch shadows on a wall and believe those shadows are reality. The chains are not external. The chains are mental. They are made of familiarity, of what has always been, of what everyone around you accepts without question. When one prisoner escapes and sees the actual sunlight, the actual world, they do not immediately celebrate. They are blinded and disoriented by the truth. Their entire framework of reality dissolves. And when they return to tell the others what they have seen, The others do not thank them. They want to kill them. Because the prisoner who has seen the sunlight is no longer manageable. They no longer accept the room as reality. And that refusal to accept the consensus reality of the cave, is the most threatening thing a human being can do to the social systems built around them. Freud understood this as a psychological truth about how systems maintain themselves. He observed that society functions by suppressing the individual's most powerful drives, creativity, sexuality, aggression, the desire for total freedom, and redirecting them into socially acceptable channels. He called it civilization's discontents. The price of living in an organized society is the systematic compression of individual potential into manageable, productive, non-threatening forms. The system does not hate you. The system does not even know it is a system. It simply rewards compliance and punishes deviation, consistently and from birth, until compliance becomes indistinguishable from identity. Robert Greene puts it most directly. He says that the single most consistent pattern he has observed across human history is this: systems always move to neutralize the people who threaten them. Not with violence necessarily, with something far more effective, with social pressure, with the withdrawal of approval, with the label of difficult, arrogant, unrealistic, unstable, too much. And because human beings are deeply, powerfully, biologically social creatures, because the fear of rejection from the tribe is wired into us at the same level as the fear of physical pain, most people choose the room over the sunlight every single time. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. Part 2. The first wall. School. Let me tell you what school actually is. Not what it claims to be. Not the aspiration. What it functionally does to the specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable individual human being who enters it. You arrive at school at 5 or 6 years old. You are chaotic, curious, obsessively interested in specific things, terrified of other things, incapable of sitting still, driven by questions that do not have neat answers, alive in ways that are inconvenient and inefficient and magnificent. And school's first task, before reading, before mathematics, before any content at all, is to teach you to sit still and wait, to wait for permission to speak, to wait for the bell to move, to wait for the teacher to tell you what matters, to subordinate your attention, your curiosity, your internal rhythm to an external clock and an external authority. This is not incidental. This is the curriculum. Everything else is secondary to this. Now, I want to be careful here. There are extraordinary teachers. There are schools that genuinely nurture individual greatness. I am not talking about those. I am talking about the structural logic of the institution. The factory model of education that was designed, not metaphorically but literally, to produce compliant industrial workers. The Prussian education system of the 19th century, which became the template for modern schooling across most of the world, was explicitly designed to produce obedient, punctual, productive citizens who could follow instructions without questioning authority. The designers said this openly. They were not hiding it. And the core technology of that system, grades, is one of the most powerful behavior modification tools ever invented. Plato understood what grades do before grades existed. He described how when you attach external reward to a behavior, you systematically destroy the intrinsic motivation that made that behavior valuable in the first place. A child who explores mathematics out of pure curiosity, for the sheer joy of the pattern, the puzzle, the discovery, will do so indefinitely, with increasing depth and creativity. The moment you grade that curiosity, you transform it. Now the child is not exploring mathematics. The child is performing for evaluation. And the question that drives them is no longer what is true but what is wanted. That shift, from intrinsic to extrinsic motivation, from internal authority to external authority, is perhaps the most consequential thing that happens to a person in their formal education. And it happens so early, so continuously, so thoroughly, that most people carry it into adulthood completely unreflected upon. Freud would call this the installation of the superego through institutional authority. The internalization of external judgment until the external judge disappears and is replaced by an internal one that is, if anything, even harsher. The child who was afraid of the teacher's grade becomes the adult who is afraid of their own judgment, who cannot make a decision without imagining how it will be evaluated, who cannot create without immediately critiquing, who cannot try without preemptively failing in their own mind. Robert Greene adds a dimension that most people miss. He points out that schools do not just teach subjects. They teach a specific relationship with knowledge. The relationship being taught is this: knowledge comes from authority, not from experience. The teacher knows. You do not know. Your job is to receive, retain, and reproduce, not to question, challenge, or discover. This relationship with knowledge, the belief that wisdom flows from the credentialed and established toward the uncredentialed and aspiring, shapes how people relate to information for the rest of their lives. It is why most adults, when they encounter an idea that challenges what they were officially taught, experience it not as interesting but as threatening. It is why expertise is often confused with correctness and outsider insight is dismissed without examination. The child who would have been a revolutionary thinker learns to give the expected answer, not because they are told to lie, because the expected answer gets the grade. And the grade means safety, and safety means everything to a social creature in an institutional environment. All children are born artists. The problem is how to remain an artist once we grow up. That was Pablo Picasso. And it is not romantic sentiment. It is a precise clinical observation about what the institution of school does to the specific human capacity it claims to be developing. Part 3. The second wall. Family. This is the section that is going to be the most difficult to hear, because the family is where love lives. And I am not going to diminish that. The love is real. The care is real. The sacrifice that most parents make for their children is one of the most profound forces in human experience. But love and limitation can exist in exactly the same gesture. And in families, they almost always do. Freud spent his entire career trying to help people understand this. He observed that the family is not just a biological unit. It is a psychological system, with its own power dynamics, its own unspoken rules, its own inherited myths about what is possible and what is dangerous and what a person like us does and does not do. And the child inherits all of it, not by being taught explicitly, by absorbing the emotional atmosphere of the home the way a sponge absorbs water, through the quality of attention given to certain choices and withdrawn from others, through the stories told about relatives who tried something different and what happened to them, through the subtle contraction of energy that happens when the child expresses a desire that falls outside the family's invisible map of acceptable ambition. These are not dramatic moments. That is what makes them so effective. A single raised eyebrow, a slight pause before responding to a dream, a casual comment, "That's not really for people like us," or "Don't get too big for your boots," or "Be realistic," repeated often enough that the child begins to hear it in their own inner voice long after no one is saying it anymore. Freud called this the installation of the family romance, the set of unconscious beliefs, loyalties, and prohibitions that a child develops in relation to their parents and that shape their adult emotional and professional life in ways they almost never fully recognize. Here is one of the most consistent and most painful patterns he observed. When a child begins to exceed the level of achievement or visibility that their parents reached, when they begin to genuinely surpass the family's ceiling, they often experience a profound and inexplicable anxiety, an impulse to pull back, to sabotage, to make themselves smaller again. This is not jealousy from the parents in any simple sense. It is more complex and more unconscious than that. The child's psyche, deeply loyal to the family system that kept them alive and loved, interprets their own advancement as a kind of betrayal, as a statement that the family was not enough, as a departure from the tribe that feels, at the deepest biological level, like potential death. So they return, not consciously, not deliberately, but through a pattern of decisions that always somehow result in a return to the familiar level, to the ceiling the family established. Robert Greene documents this in terms of the social script. Every family, he says, has a script, a story about who they are, what kind of people they produce, what they are entitled to, what is beyond them. And the script is not written, it is performed, daily, in every interaction, in the vocabulary used to describe success and failure, in the attitudes modeled toward money and ambition, in the stories repeated about people who tried something unconventional and were humbled. The child who grows up inside that script does not choose it, it chooses them. It becomes the invisible architecture of their self-concept long before they are old enough to evaluate whether it is true, and when they eventually encounter an opportunity that requires them to write a different story, to step outside the family script into genuine possibility, the pull back to the familiar is not experienced as limitation. It is experienced as wisdom, as groundedness, as knowing who you are. Plato said this is the nature of the cave. The prisoner who has been there long enough does not feel the chains. They feel like posture, like the natural way of standing. The most devastating thing about family programming is not that it limits you, it is that it limits you while feeling like love. And so the limit feels unquestionable, because to question it is to question the love. And the love is the most important thing you have. Part 4. The third wall. Culture. The third wall is the largest and the hardest to see, precisely because it is everywhere. Culture is the water you swim in, the air you breathe, the lens through which you see everything. including yourself, and the lens is invisible because you have never seen through any other one. Every culture has a consensus reality, a shared, largely unexamined agreement about what a successful life looks like, what a respectable person does, what ambitions are legitimate and which ones mark you as delusional or dangerous. And that consensus reality is enforced not by law or force but by something far more powerful, the continuous, ambient pressure of social judgment. The look that communicates you have stepped outside the acceptable range. The tone of voice that makes your unconventional idea sound like a symptom. The joke made at the expense of someone who tried something big and failed, which is not really a joke about them. It is a warning to everyone else in the room. Plato identified this as the mechanism by which societies reproduce themselves across generations without any central authority needing to enforce it. He called it the force of doxa, common opinion, the consensus of the crowd. And he argued that doxa is perhaps the most powerful force in human social life because it operates without a face. You cannot argue with it. You cannot petition it for an exception. It simply is the atmosphere. And like any atmosphere, the creatures shaped by it cannot imagine breathing anything different. Freud's contribution here is the concept of the reality principle. He observed that the individual psyche, in the process of socialization, gradually learns to suppress its most expansive desires and conform to the possible as defined by the social environment. And crucially, this suppression does not feel like suppression. It feels like maturity. It feels like growing up. The person who has successfully internalized the culture's limits experiences those limits as their own preferences. They do not feel constrained. They feel satisfied with wanting what they have been given permission to want. This is the most elegant feature of the system. The prison that installs itself inside you and then dissolves the memory of installation. Robert Greene identifies what he calls the social mirror, the process by which most people develop their sense of identity not from the inside out but from the outside in. They look at the people around them, the people the culture holds up as successful and admirable, and they reverse, engineer an identity that is likely to receive similar approval. They become skilled at reading the room rather than reading themselves. And here is what this produces at the cultural level, and why this matters for every person watching this video. A culture that trains its members to manage their ambitions downward, to suppress deviation, to reward compliance, does not just produce average individuals. It produces an average collective intelligence. It systematically prevents the emergence of the ideas, inventions, and frameworks that only arise from people who refuse to stay within the consensus. Every genuinely transformative idea in human history was initially treated by the culture as dangerous, delusional, or offensive. Every single one. The heliocentric solar system, germ theory, democracy, the unconscious mind, the theory of evolution, the idea that all human beings are equal. Each of these was not just an intellectual challenge to existing knowledge. It was a social threat to the people and institutions whose power depended on the existing knowledge being true. And the culture responded to each of them exactly as Plato predicted, with ridicule first, then with resistance, then with persecution, and finally, only after the idea had broken through by force of truth, with adoption and the pretense that it had never been seriously questioned. The culture that killed Socrates did not think it was killing greatness. It thought it was protecting order. It thought it was doing the necessary work of maintaining the stability that made everything else possible. It was wrong, but it was not uniquely wrong. It was doing exactly what cultures do, with exactly the mechanisms cultures use, for exactly the reasons cultures always give. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Part 5, The People Who Escaped. Now I want to tell you about the people who got out, not to mythologize them, not to make them seem superhuman, but because their stories contain the specific information you need about what the exit from the prison actually looks like. Leonardo da Vinci, born illegitimate in 15th century Florence, could not attend university, was excluded from the formal guild systems that produced recognized artists and thinkers of the era, which meant that no institution ever got to finish installing its ceiling on him. He did not learn to stay in one discipline because no discipline fully claimed him. He did not learn to subordinate his curiosity to a professional identity because he never fully had one. He followed his obsessive interest wherever it led, from painting to anatomy to engineering to geology to music to philosophy, with absolutely no concern for whether these interests were appropriate for a person of his social category. His notebooks contain 10,000 pages of observations, inventions, and questions that were centuries ahead of the context in which they were produced. He designed functioning flying machines, solar power concentrators, and armored vehicles in the 1490s, not as fantasy, as engineering. The institutions of his era called him unreliable, scattered, unable to finish projects. He He left many major commissions incomplete because he was already thinking about something else that interested him more. What the institutions called weakness was actually the uncorrupted signal of a mind that had never fully accepted the ceiling. He followed his own internal authority, his insatiable curiosity, rather than the external authority of guild, patron, or social expectation. And 500 years later, we are still studying him. Nikola Tesla. We have talked about Tesla before, but I want to revisit him through this specific lens. Tesla arrived in America with almost nothing. No credentials recognized by the American establishment. No social connections. No family name that opened doors. He went to work for Thomas Edison, who immediately recognized his extraordinary ability and immediately began structuring a relationship in which Tesla's output would serve Edison's empire rather than Tesla's own vision. Tesla eventually walked away from that arrangement, from security, from validation, from the institutional support that would have made his life comfortable, because he had a vision that the institution could not contain. A vision of free, universally accessible electrical power that would have fundamentally disrupted every existing power structure, literal and metaphorical, in the industrial world. The institutions did not just fail to support that vision, they actively destroyed it. J.P. Morgan, who had been funding Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower project, withdrew financing the moment he understood that Tesla's system would make it impossible to charge people for electricity. He could not put a meter on it. There was no business model. And so it died. Tesla's mistake, if we must call it that, was the same mistake Socrates made. He understood the technology. He did not fully understand the power architecture surrounding it. He thought truth and utility were sufficient to overcome institutional resistance. They are not. They are never sufficient alone. What the escapees had in common here is what I have found studying the people who actually escaped the prison of average, who built legacies that the system could not ultimately contain. They did not escape by fighting the system directly. Direct confrontation almost always fails, as Socrates and Tesla and countless others demonstrate. The system is older, larger, more patient, and more deeply embedded than any individual who attacks it head on. They escaped by building something the system could not ignore. Something real enough, useful enough, true enough, that the consensus reality had to eventually reorganize itself around it. They redirected the energy of resistance inward, into the work, rather than outward into the argument. They did not spend their primary energy trying to convince the cave's inhabitants that the sun exists. They spent their primary energy in the sunlight, building things that eventually cast shadows back into the cave that even the prisoners could not deny. And they developed, each of them, what Robert Greene calls a sovereign identity, a sense of self rooted in their own internal authority rather than in the approval or disapproval of the social environment. They could hear the criticism, the dismissal, the ridicule, and not be destroyed by it. Not because they were indifferent to human connection, but because their sense of reality was not dependent on the consensus endorsing it. Plato described this as the philosophical life, the life of a person who has seen the sunlight and cannot unsee it. Not a comfortable life, not a socially easy life, but the only life, he argued, that is actually fully human. Part 6. How to break the walls. The question you are probably asking is, what do I actually do with this? And I want to give you something concrete, not a 10-step program, not a productivity hack, but the fundamental moves that the people who have genuinely broken free have all made, in some form, in some order. Move 1. See the walls. You cannot dismantle a prison you believe is landscape. The first and most essential work is perception. Seeing clearly, for the first time, that what you have been calling your personality, your preferences, your realistic assessment of what is possible for someone like you, is significantly a construction, built by forces outside you, installed before you had any say in the matter. This does not mean your preferences are not real. It does not mean your personality is false. It means that underneath the constructed version of you, underneath the one that was shaped to be manageable, there is something else. Something older and more primary. The curiosity and drive and desire to matter that you arrived with. Finding that original signal, separating it from the layers of conditioning over it, that is the beginning of everything. Move 2. Identify your specific ceiling. Every person has a different specific ceiling. The ceiling installed by your particular family, in your particular culture, through your particular educational experiences, is uniquely yours. And it lives in a specific domain: money, visibility, relationships, creative expression, ambition, worthiness. The way to find it is to look at the places in your life where you consistently reach a certain level and then, somehow, things fall apart. Where you keep arriving at the same wall. Where the pattern repeats regardless of your effort or intelligence or intention. That pattern is not bad luck. It is a ceiling. and seeing it as a ceiling rather than as fate is the moment it becomes possible to dismantle. Move 3. Audit your environment. Freud and Greene agree on this with unusual unanimity. The people around you are programming you continuously, whether any of you intends it or not. Every conversation, every relationship, every social environment is either expanding your sense of what is possible or contracting it. This does not mean abandoning the people you love. It means being honest about the programming being delivered in every relationship and making conscious choices about what you absorb and what you decline. And it means actively, deliberately seeking environments, physical, intellectual, social, where the ceiling is higher than the one you grew up under, where the consensus reality is more expansive, where what is normal exceeds what you have been trained to consider possible. Your ceiling will rise to meet the ceiling of the room you consistently spend time in. This is not motivation. This is neuroscience. Move 4. Rebuild your relationship with deviation. The system trains you to experience deviation from the norm as dangerous, as a signal of error, of arrogance, of disconnection from reality. The emotional experience of standing out, of doing something that nobody around you is doing, of wanting something that nobody around you is wanting, is, for most people, deeply uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a signal about the quality of your idea. It is a reflex. A conditioned response that was installed to keep you in line and that activates regardless of whether staying in line is actually in your interest. Learning to tolerate that discomfort, to sit with the social anxiety of deviation without immediately retreating to safety, is one of the most important skills a person can develop. And like all skills, it is developed through practice, through small deliberate acts of deviation, chosen not for their outcome but for the practice of tolerating the feeling. Every time you do this and survive, every time you step outside the consensus and find that the world does not end, the reflex weakens slightly, the window of tolerance expands slightly, the prison wall loses, fractionally but permanently, one small piece of its power. Move 5. Create something real. This is where everything converges. The deepest, most durable escape from the prison of average is not psychological insight alone. It is not environment design alone. It is not even the development of sovereign identity alone. It is the act of making something real. Something that did not exist before you made it. Something that required you to access the part of yourself that was there before the conditioning. The original curiosity, the original drive, the original sense that you had something to contribute that no one else could contribute in exactly the same way. Because when you make something real, when you produce a body of work, build something, write something, develop something that comes genuinely from inside you rather than from what you were trained to produce, something irreversible happens. You have evidence, not theoretical, not aspirational, evidence that the person below the conditioning exists and is capable, evidence that the ceiling was not the sky. And once you have that evidence, once you have held the sunlight in your hands even for one moment, the cave looks different from the inside, not less real, but smaller. Closing. Let me bring everything together. You were born with something extraordinary, not talent necessarily, not genius, but the basic human endowment, curiosity, creativity, the desire to matter, the capacity to imagine and to build and to think in ways that no one has thought before. And 3 systems, school, family, culture, operating simultaneously and largely unconsciously, have been working since the day you arrived to compress that endowment into something more manageable, something that fits the room, something that does not threaten the ceiling. They did this, mostly, without malice. The teachers were passing on what they were taught. The family was protecting what they loved. The culture was reproducing what kept it stable. None of them saw the prison. They were in it too. Plato said that the cave is not a punishment. It is just where most people live. And the prisoner who escapes does not do so because they were better or more deserving than the others. They do so because something in them, some original, persistent, unkillable signal, kept returning them to the question of whether the shadow was really the thing. Freud said the work of becoming fully human is the work of making the unconscious conscious, of seeing the programs running beneath your choices and asking, for the first time with full honesty, whether those programs are serving you or serving the system that installed them. Robert Greene says the sovereign individual, the person who has genuinely escaped the prison of average, is not the person who successfully rebels against every system. It is the person who has developed the internal authority to distinguish between the walls that protect them and the walls that contain them, and who has the courage to dismantle the second kind. The prison is real, the walls are real, but they are made of belief, of habit, of the accumulated weight of other people's ceilings resting on your shoulders. And belief, unlike stone, can be changed. Habit, unlike iron, can be broken. The ceiling that was installed in you by people who could not see past their own ceiling, it is not yours. It was never yours. You were born without it. And somewhere below everything that has been built on top of you since, that original person, the one who arrived before the room got to them, is still there. Still curious. Still capable. Still waiting. The question is not whether you can get out. The question is whether you are ready to see the walls for what they actually are. If this video made you see something differently, share it with one person who you think is ready to see it too. And subscribe, because this is what we do here every week. We go into the ideas that the room would prefer you didn't think about.